Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene showed what appeared to be censored, sexually explicit photos of Hunter Biden during a House Oversight and Accountability Committee hearing yesterday, drawing condemnation from Democratic committee members, the Washington Post reports. The committee was listening to testimony from two Internal Revenue Service whistleblowers who were involved in an investigation into Hunter Biden's taxes, according to the Post. During Greene's questioning, she showed poster boards of the graphic images. Greene made the claim that Hunter Biden recorded multiple sex tapes with a prostitute that he had paid for with money from his law firm, Owasco's bank account.
Mr. Shapley.
Come on.
Mr. Chairman, we're 1 minute and 53 seconds over. As long as Ms. Ocasio-Cortez can get equal time, she can keep going.
I will let Ms. Greene wrap up. 5 seconds, and then I'll give Mr. Mafume additional time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Shapley, you started an investigation into Hunter Biden, codenamed Sportsman, which opened in November of 2018. It was an offshoot of an investigation the IRS was conducting into a foreign-based amateur online pornography platform. This is evidence of Hunter Biden making sex. Excuse me, this is my time. Making pornography.
Greene asked the whistleblowers if Hunter Biden could have violated the Mann Act by buying a ticket for an alleged prostitute to visit him in Washington, D.C.
In your prior testimony, you stated that the prosecutorial team was investigating violations of the Mann Act. Is that correct, Mr. Ziegler?
That is correct.
Regarding the Mann Act, if a person is transported across state lines for sexual activity, such as prostitution, that could be a violation of a federal law. Is that correct?
I actually recently looked at the federal law regarding Mann Act, and I believe that that is correct, but I would refer you to the DOJ manual.
Thank you. I would like to present this to the committee. This is showing Hunter Biden paying for a victim's United flight from LA to Dulles. This was I believe this is a violation of the Mann Act. This is Hunter Biden's, this is his proof that he bought the ticket. He bought it for this woman right here. He flew her from Los Angeles to Washington on June 14th, flew her back to Los Angeles, California on June 15th.
So this was a little bit of a wake up in the middle of this, 6 hours worth of hearing testimony?
You mean the images?
It was a little bit of a departure from the typical line of questioning. Yeah. Remember that the two witnesses are IRS investigators that were here to comment on whether or not there was a tax fraud case, a tax liability that wasn't sufficiently investigated or followed up on by the prosecutors. And it did feel like this was a frolicking detour that didn't exactly land. Many of her questions to the witnesses, they responded with basically saying, I have to refer you to the Mann Act. I have to refer you to areas outside of my own personal expertise. And while there is a clip going around of the end of her colloquy where a Democratic representative it starts to interrupt and basically ask what the point of all of this is. Mostly, she spent most of her time just asking these questions and showing those images without interruption. And, for people who find this to be very salacious, I mean, I think most people find it to be salacious, but for people who find this to be disqualifying or reflect badly on Joe Biden as opposed to just Hunter Biden as he was struggling with addiction and making choices that I think many people would be critical of, they'll see this as relevant, and everyone else will see this as a kind of a bad faith frolicking detour.
Sure. And, to be clear, I think the Mann Act is a bad law. I'm a libertarian and I support consensual prostitution. I don't think that should be illegal. But as you've brought up with the taking federal documents, Trump stuff, and if they've charged people for they've thrown the book at people for violating that. The same is true with this act. It is absolutely the case that people get prosecuted for this. Very serious prosecution for breaking this law. It does appear on the face of it that, what Marjorie Taylor described very colorfully with images that no one in the world needed to see, but that's beside the point. There is certainly some very much underlying truth there. Now, so we're talking about special treatment. Again, I don't think he should be prosecuted for that. I don't think anyone should be prosecuted for this. But why wouldn't they prosecute him for this when they routinely prosecute people for this? That's the question a lot of people are going to be asking themselves.
Yeah, I mean, there was also a moment earlier in the hearing where one of the Democratic representatives, I forget which now, pointed out that Donald Trump wasn't charged with the full slate of violations that he could have been charged with in the context of the documents trial. As I mentioned in an earlier segment, there were questions raised by Democrats about why the people who are so concerned about prosecutorial discretion in this case didn't seem to have concerns when Trump was openly advocating for Michael Flynn and others not to have the full weight of the Justice Department heaped down on them. And so I appreciate the argument, and I very much agree with the argument that poor and working class people get the book thrown at them and wealthy, connected people don't. But this does seem to be a situation where a bunch of millionaires are sitting in the room using poor people as a cudgel to beat each other. And the reality is both sides, everyone in that room has been in a position to defend the wealthy people in their own political camp from getting the same treatment as poor people. So again, I sort of feel like no one in the room is really qualified, has the credibility rather to make that argument.
To defend Trump, then yes, it's totally hypocritical.
But everyone in that room, I mean, I know that you're not doing this, but most of the people in that room, if not everybody because Republicans basically are in a position where they cannot be critical of Trump if they want to stay in the party, has defended Trump in those exact same ways. And when Trump was using the Justice Department to affect his political goals and his personal goals, there were no hearings being called to investigate whether or not we had prosecutorial equity here between the rich and the very poor. So what we have, look, the argument underlying it is sound, but what we have here is one party using the legitimate argument of inequity in our justice system to create more inequity in our justice system and run cover for their own party
it's not
selectively.
Like Trump is getting away with it. He's being brought to justice very slowly and deliberately, but
there's the question of Trump's the charges against Trump, and there's the question of
trying to put him in jail.
Of Trump trying to use his Justice Department to get other people in his orbit from having to face responsibility. That is the question. And moreover, it was Jamie Raskins who was pointing out that prosecutorial discretion means that Trump was only believed, he said, charged selectively with the document retention crimes after the August Mar-a-Lago raid incident, even though technically he was in violation of those rules before that, right? So that there are always these kinds of decisions made. And I completely, look, I said this on the show before, I don't doubt, it would seem impossible to me that the fact of Hunter Biden being Joe Biden's son didn't come into play as they're making these kind of decisions. It seems impossible that wouldn't be the case. But specifically, it seems like the Republicans are saying that if he wasn't maximally charged with everything, then that's evidence of bias that should somehow negatively reflect on Joe Biden in a way that Donald Trump's open bias in advocating for people in his orbit should not negatively reflect on him.
It should negatively reflect on him. It does negatively reflect on him, and they're trying to put him in prison.
No. Not for the things that he has been accused of.
Right, not for pardoning Paul.
But it's not just the pardons. I wish I could pull up the actual pay to play, tit for tat statements that he made. But he tweeted, and they brought it up in these hearings, and I wonder if we can maybe pull a clip later. But there were these specific tweets and statements that Joe Biden said where when his Justice Department, his own Justice Department, made decisions not to, or either to charge various members, whether it's Michael Flynn or some of these other figures, to go after them, to investigate them, he called them phony and fake and biased and inappropriate, and that it was a witch hunt.
Trump is bad,
and has routinely flipped on his own appointed Justice Department members when they do try to equitably carry out justice. And many Democrats during this hearing kept pointing out also that so many of the figures in this, like Weiss, who ultimately had the discretion not to charge Hunter Biden further, was a Trump appointee. And that Biden normally, a new president normally, would have had much more turnover in this process than Biden ultimately chose to have. demonstrating again that if we're really looking at these two respective administrations and asking about whether or not Joe Biden's administration is behaving in a way that is particularly unfair or biased, at least vis-a-vis Trump's.
Let's not pit them against each other. It just goes to speak to the weaponization of the Justice Department in general.
But I don't think you can just look at this in a vacuum when you have Republican after Republican sitting on that panel who is actively carrying water for Trump, making not just the same kinds of decisions, but much worse and more explicitly biased decisions in his own administration. And that is what this is the problem. Many of the Democrats on the panel last night pointed out, yes, the justice system is unequal, but it feels dirty, it feels wrong to be sitting here talking about a two-tiered criminal justice system when you want to ratchet up mass incarceration, when you're talking about someone like Donald Trump, who, said that the Central Park Five should be not only jailed, but killed when they were later proven to be innocent, and one just won like a city council position in New York City. To acknowledge, to use that core truth and not apply it evenly betrays your commitment to that principle in a way that makes you an uncredible actor in this scenario
no one in
to
that
many
room
people.
Is doing that.
Is doing what?
Applying it evenly.
What do you mean?
I mean, they're just running cover for, you're right, the one side's running cover for Trump, the other side's running cover for the Bidens. But we're talking about, like, I have no interest in defending Trump for all the weird, self-destructive, quasi-legal and also illegal things he has done. But that doesn't have anything to do with whether Hunter Biden got a much more lenient deal arrangement from federal prosecutors and IRS investigators and everybody else than you would have or I would than people have in those situations. That's what we're talking about.
Well,
doesn't have to do anything with what
Robbie,
Trump. It's not Trump. It's not a Trump issue.
That's explicitly not what they're talking about, because in the hearing they are saying they're not inviting they're explicitly inviting, Republicans are explicitly inviting a comparison between how poor people are treated and non-famous people are treated and how Hunter Biden is being treated. They are explicitly using that comparison when the reality is
that's a fair comparison.
The question is whether or not they actually care about that.
Well, they're all politicians. None of them actually care about anything.
Well, I do. And I do think that some of the people in that room do, because they've spent their entire lives advocating for the rights of poor people. For example, one of the points of interest that several of the Democrats, including Jamie Raskin, brought up was that it's very ironic for Republicans to be sitting there with these two IRS whistleblowers telling them how important their work is, when at the same time, Republicans have been advocating for cuts to the IRS that would enable people in their professional function to go after wealthier tax cheats. A point that was made was that lower income Americans have extremely high tax compliance. We've talked in this show about how the most audited city in America is like a small, very poor town in Mississippi. And the whole argument that Democrats are making is that at times when the IRS was more highly funded, 10, 15 years ago, the percentage of investigations that were targeted at millionaires and billionaires was significantly higher than when you cut funding to the IRS and no longer have the resources to do the more complicated investigations that are required to go after rich people. So they're sitting there saying, we have these problems with the
more funding, and then we'll really go after Hunter Biden.
Well, do you not see that there's some irony there of saying we want the IRS to do more investigations of rich elite people at the same time that we say we're going to cut their funding to do exactly that?
There's a lack of belief that they will. There's a lack of trust in this organization for the reasons being highlighted by those whistleblowers. But
what I'm telling you is that we don't need to speculate. We have the last 50 years of IRS activity, and we have information about at what points in time they have done more audits proportionately on wealthy people versus poor people. And what we know for a fact, and people, I understand the skepticism of funding the IRS more given that the IRS can be weaponized in these ways. But you have to contend with the fact that we know for a fact that in recent history, when the FBI was funded more, more of their resources went to going after millionaires and billionaires. And when they are underfunded, they have to do the easy pro forma audits of poor and working class people. And if you have a concern about them doing that, you could say that there is a quota where the IRS isn't going to go after poor people anymore, though the IRS is going to make sure that the proportion of audits that they do over poor people is not going to go up with more funding. But that is not what the Republicans have tried to do. Republicans, who maybe not so coincidentally are also millionaires, maybe not billionaires, I don't know if there's any billionaires in Congress, but definitely millionaires and multimillionaires, are defunding the very organizations that are tasked with going after them and making sure that they pay their taxes. And so in the middle of all of this, people who are pretending, are saying that they're fighting for poor and working class people, are very explicitly both going after the organization that's supposed to make some equity between how many taxes poor and working class people pay and rich people pay. At the same time, they're putting two specific IRS agents on a pedestal saying, oh my gosh, you're doing great work, but only because in this very narrow instance, you are attacking my enemy. And I think that would be fair. I have no interest in whether or not Hunter Biden is charged more or less. I think that it's probably right and fair that he should have to pay the same consequences of all of the people that suffered under Joe Biden's crime bill and the inequities, the generational harm that crime bill caused. But at the same time, I cannot not comment on the deep hypocrisy of the Republican lawmakers who very clearly have no interest in actually uplifting the interests of the poor and working class constituents that they should be spending time and money on right now. But instead, they are trying to make something out of Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's son's terrible life choices and struggles with addiction because they frankly don't have a smoking gun to go after Joe Biden himself.
All right, they're making, I think we got, we're not going to play more of it. They're making something of it because of the hypocrisy and the unfairness you're pointing out. That's why it's a thing. I don't care about defending the Republicans. I think they're hypocritical too.
But Democrats aren't trying to defund the IRS. Democrats aren't the ones speaking out, saying one thing out of one side of their mouth and the other out of the other here. You know, and the fact is that even Trump has benefited from prosecutorial discretion. Trump has been mad at his own appointees for doing the work. This is the idea that this is about bias and that every aspect of this is about bias starts to fall through when you're realizing that even in this instance, we're still talking about Trump appointees. And when Trump was president, he was mad about what his own Justice Department was doing, because it does seem like unless that Trump and his associates have no accountability, and Biden and his associates have maximal accountability, people in that room aren't going to be
Trump
happy.
Put in place people who did not serve his agenda or work towards the things that he elucidated when he ran for president. He put in people who are career government employees who supported the previous version of the Republican Party and thus are basically Democrats now or part of whatever coalition of deep state-ish interests you want to describe, who are all about turning the federal government in ways that violate the civil liberties and free speech of not just Donald Trump, boo-hoo, who cares, no one, but also everyday Americans. And so when there's a shining moment of hypocrisy, of spotlight on a person, a well-connected political Democrat family, the Biden family, who is getting easy treatment for tax fraud, gun crimes, drug crimes, things like the Mann Act, when anybody else, smaller and more insignificant than him, would have had the book thrown at them, it's going to be called out. That's not to absolve any of the stains of the sins of the Republican Party or of Trump himself. But maybe it's not a hypocrisy argument on Democrats. It's this whole system has been captured by forces that the American conservative voters are skeptical of and afraid of and want to dismantle on some level. And that's what we're talking about. All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.